Uh, I think what we're going to try and do in this session is talk about and think about technology, tech policy in some ways that those of us who are tech sector regulars are not used to. I see a lot of familiar faces here, peers, people I've interacted with, whose work I've read, videos I've watched. And my sense is that we operate, those of us who are in this space, we operate on the basis of certain set assumptions, perspectives, starting points in terms of what technology is about, what the tech sector is about, what tech policy is about. And I think today, as is always the case with Usha, we're going to see that challenged. We're going to see less discussion maybe about platform regulation, intermediary liability, some of the high-level topics that we're used to engaging with. We're going to be hearing about things like lithium mining, environmental pollution, energy consumption of data centers, and as a result of Zoom calls and the harmful impact that has on our ecosystems. So with that, Usha, thank you so much, welcome. And I guess I'll start by saying that we were thinking of titling the panel, Will AI Destroy Us All? But we thought that since it's 10-year anniversary, we'll have a more optimistic note. But to start with, I'll just ask you, and I see you've got a wonderful collection of books here, so I'm sure you'll be taking this conversation forward in multiple directions. But maybe I'll just start by asking about some of the ways in which you've been thinking about the philosophy of technology, rethinking our approach to technology. And finally, Usha, if I could just take this opportunity to say that there's so many people here who are mid-20s, early 30s, probably will be spending the next 2-3 decades of their life in tech policy. So what is a way that we can use this occasion, this platform of 10 years, to think about how we can rethink the next 10, 20, 30 years? Like I said, I won't name names, but I see some tech policy journalists here, and they can maybe take things forward based on what you say in terms of rethinking old ideas, assumptions, shibboleths. Yeah, over to you, Usha. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sachin. I think I should start with saying that I may not be talking so much about tech policy. I may be speaking to people who are working on tech policy, but I'm not sure I'll be talking tech policy. And I know I will not be talking tech regulation. I actually think regulation only works where you intend to regulate, and regulation only works where you know what you're dealing with. And I think in this case, both of those circumstances don't exist. So I won't spend any time on regulation. What I may start with saying is that your 10 years has been a very important 10 years, CCGs. It's not about CCG at this stage, but it is about what these 10 years have done. It's something I've said often enough, and I'm just going to say it again, that the early years of this century, there was a lot of excitement about what technology was providing for us. It was producing all kinds of imagination, and it seemed like the beginning of a new kind of life, where the mobile phone meant that you were connected all the time, the internet meant that you could communicate instantly, and there were a range of things that were happening. Of course, social media started coming in. Facebook perhaps was the first thing that was completely unconnected with the defense sector in the US, which kind of began to take everybody's mind, attention, and produced a lot of excitement. And that was very nice to see. I will confess that I did not jump onto it, but I must say that when I saw my friends feeling differently about contacting people, getting to know where they are, watching what is happening in the rest of the world, where the web was a space, where the internet was something that told you, that took you to parts of the world to which you may never otherwise be able to go, where you clicked one word and you got 10 things in response. Those were very exciting times, and I have to confess that at that stage, I did very little to question technology, because it didn't seem like it was necessary. But from about 2000 now looking back, we should have known it from even before. But for many of us who were not involved in the tech space, it seemed like it was fine till we started seeing that two things were happening. One, that we were being trained to look at ourselves in a certain way, to look at all of human beings in a certain way. Like human beings, like all of us, people are, could be corrupt, could be terrorists, could be black marketeers, could be siphoning off things. So a certain kind of negative image of the human being, which over a period of time we realized was one way by which technology could be propped up as that which is infallible, efficient, convenient, but also incorruptible, so a range of things that the human being was not, we were being told technology is. Along with that, it very soon became clear that there was this hypnotic effect that this kind of technology was having on people, where you could not pick up what was on offer. If Facebook said, here I am telling you that you can communicate with whoever, get onto my platform, you would immediately get onto it. You didn't want to be left out. And everybody was on Facebook. And then when it was Twitter, everybody was on Twitter. WhatsApp, everyone's on WhatsApp. Everybody has to have a phone. I mean, I come from a generation where you have one phone in the house and you don't really carry it away anywhere to speak. You speak in the presence of other people, and there are, so in a very strange way, that which is considered private today, and which is, which one may think of as promoting privacy, has in fact become the thing that destroys privacy. And that which existed before got private with just a handheld phone that you could walk around with, so without having to carry it make your life there. So I think there are some recognitions that are needed, that are becoming important for us to see before we can talk anything in the nature of tech policy. And I think the one thing that I will say before we move to the next phase is that if we are scared to see in the mirror, to look in the mirror and see what tech has done to us, then we'll never involve ourselves in tech policy. We'll be working in the creation of multiple mythologies, and that's different from the world around us.
Absolutely. Back to that time where you first heard, say, people talking on their mobiles, lawyers in court to show off that they can afford it. I think you said somewhere that it used to cost 16 rupees a call or something like that, and how you saw slowly people's behavior start to change because of the use of mobile phones. People were becoming more atomized. They would start ignoring people around them. So just if you could, again, for the benefit of those who are going to take tech policy forward, it'll be so interesting to get those insights and tidbits as to what that world was like when you were so fascinated by it.
When the mobile phone first came in and it was getting adopted, it was very expensive. It was like, an incoming call was 16 rupees, an outgoing call was 16 rupees, and then it became 8 rupees for a while, and then, till the costs really dropped. So it wasn't as pervasive as it became. Now, everything that gets cheap doesn't get picked up. So there is some logic to why this was. I'm sorry, it's blinding my eye. Okay, thank you. So there must have been some logic to why people felt impelled to get onto it the moment they could get it. So the early phases, I think that there are a number of things that helped the mobile phone pick itself up and be among many people. It was certainly convenient in the beginning. I remember people feeling that they could go anywhere and be anywhere, and they didn't have to sit in an office behind a desk for anybody to reach them. They could be reached wherever they were. So it gave the freedom. It's not only about communication. It gave them the freedom to move around wherever they wanted. And that was it was huge. I actually thought it was fascinating that that's how it was. But then, initially it was only excitement. But you find that somewhere around 2014-15, it starts changing. And the excitement slowly starts becoming, you notice the obsession. You now have departments in mental health institutions which are dealing with this obsessive handling of the mobile phone, not being able to keep off it, it's produced mental health illnesses and mental health conditions, and it's happened very fast. So and then around 2014-15 again, we start seeing how the mobile phone becomes a tool for tracking people, for keeping tabs on them. As more and more functions get onto the phone, and as people get addicted to the phone to do everything, when all their life is on the phone, then it produces along with it all the anxieties that life produces, all the anxieties that what is in that mobile phone produces. I mean, if you're looking at what is happening in the world all the time, I pick up the paper every morning and I see it, and I know how much palpitation I get when I see what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what's happening when you're using bulldozers in different places. Every morning you see this. Imagine seeing it every minute of the day. And imagine getting so obsessive that you can't get off it. And imagine the time when, like, I had a young student who was telling me, how can you not be on social media? How do you know what's happening in the world? And I said, well, you read newspapers. He said, and then he said, but I can't be without it because then I won't know what is happening. And I said, okay, let's just do a little game. So you write 5 things that you learned on social media, and I will write 5 things that I learned reading the newspapers. Let's see how many of the things you know I don't know, and how many of the things that I know you don't know. And it worked out that he didn't know any of the 5 things that I was writing about. And I know about 2 or 3 of the things that he'd written, and the other 2, honestly, I didn't care that I didn't know. That's fine. It didn't change the attitude a little bit. So there is something in this technology which I think, it's beyond tech policy, it's beyond whatever. There is a change that's being brought into us, which I think we are not pausing to recognize and question. And we are no longer making decisions about our lives ourselves. It's being made for us, and we have to figure out what that is.
And just as an aside, before I move to the next question, it's even been, I think, not having a mobile phone has even been an airport security risk for you, in terms of people not believing that you're not carrying.
Well, it's not a risk, but it's just that they say, Madam, electronic saman nikal, and I say, acha nikal diya, and they say, mobile phone bhi dal, and I say, hai nahi. Arey madam, time nahi hai, nikal. And then I'm like, okay, if a mobile phone has to go through the machine every time, why don't you put yours, I'll return it from the And when it goes through, they are actually like, what are you hiding? So there is a certain quizzical look, not every time. There are many of them who are like, it's quite normal, so it's okay. But it does happen. It's this, I don't know, there's a sense of incredulity that you can be without a mobile phone. And I'm like, actually incredulous that everyone wants to walk around with a mobile phone.
So in terms of, Usha, your comments a little bit earlier about the future, possibility of dystopianism, just to play devil's advocate, aren't we moving in the right direction?
Firstly, hang on.
Yeah.
Who's the devil in this?
in the details, which I'm about to talk about. I mean, if one look at it from the other perspective, from the other side, maybe I can say the nation wants to know that. I mean, do you want us to go back to the days of horse and buggy? I mean, hasn't technology, science, and we talked about the distinction between science and technology as well, but in terms of vaccines, look at the pandemic, look at the fact that we were able to get through it to a large extent because of social media, because of mobile phones. You look at disaster relief, on and on and on. Isn't technology our friend? Why should we, for example, be afraid of the AI revolution? What's so bad about the hype?
So I would normally say that almost anything that exists has some good in it. But I just realized that I'm talking to people who come from NLUD, and the news really has nothing that is good about it. So except for the news, I mean, they work on the death penalty, and the news is really not a good idea. Except for that, I think there is a certain logic to. Now the question, one of the reasons the books are here, it's not to tell you, oh, you must all have read this, or to say that I have read all of them, which I may or may not have. But it's also that, one voice can only say so much. So I thought we'll bring in other voices. Let me just bring in one voice now, which, since I spoke about the news, maybe we'll start with that. It's a book called The Executioner's Current. And one of the things that I think it's important for us to keep in question is whether those who are rolling out science and technology in our midst are doing it only for all the reasons that you said, which is that it is good, it's convenient, it helps in a disaster, it might help in a pandemic. By the way, many of those I would question the unquestioning faith you have in it, but that's a different story.
That the devil had.
So I'm just going to read out a short passage from this. This is a book that was written, it's called The Executioner's Current, and it's written by Richard Morin. It is a book that talks about Edison, Thomas Alva Edison, and when he found electricity and he was going to commercialize electricity, his was the direct current. And then I'll just read this, and if anything gets missed out, I'll tell you what more there was. What follows, Morin says, is the story of how Thomas Edison helped influence the state of New York to replace hanging with a new scientific and humane method of electrical execution. This is just to say that in the US you have in the Constitution a prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Hanging at that time was being seen as cruel and unusual because it takes time. It's a process where a person may not die immediately. So they had asked Edison if it would be all right to use electricity and the electric chair. Would that take it away from it being cruel and unusual punishment? It reveals how a bold, almost fearless faith in science, technology, and especially progress joined powerful economic interests and personal ambition to produce a change in the method of capital punishment. By unmasking the story behind the story, I aim to demonstrate how our most cherished social values can be manipulated to serve pecuniary interests. The way in which public policy is affected by behind-the-scenes maneuvering of powerful and often ruthless business interests. If you recognize some of this, good for you. The darker side of human nature, the desire for fame and fortune, and a fierce willingness to do whatever it takes were the main factors that motivated Edison's involvement with the electric chair. Far from representing an enlightened humanitarian concern for the welfare of the condemned, the electric chair was invented so that one major electric company, Edison, could maintain its competitive advantage over another, Westinghouse. In 1890, and it's just a brief passage more, in 1890, a Buffalo huckster named William Kemmler became the first person put to death by electricity. Although the execution itself was terribly blotched, supporters proclaimed it a huge success, a triumph of science and humanity over barbarism and brutality. In 1882, Thomas Edison launched the age of electricity by illuminating the commercial and financial districts of New York City near his Pearl Street power station. 4 years later, George Westinghouse, the inventor of the air brake, illuminated Buffalo, New York. Edison lighted New York City with direct current or DC. Westinghouse employed alternating current or AC. And then the book goes on to tell us how Edison had been approached in, I think, 1 year before it, so it must be 1987, 86, 87, by the government, asking him to give them an opinion whether using electricity and the electric chair would take it away from being cruel and unusual punishment. He sent the question back saying, I will not answer this because I do not believe in the death penalty. 2 years later, when he was in commercial competition with Westinghouse, and they came back with the question saying, please help us, we understand you're opposed to the death penalty, but help us with this. He made a calculated decision to answer the question and to say, yes, it will take it away from this, except use alternating current. Because he then wanted to advertise Westinghouse's alternating current as the killer current. This told me a lot about how we need to think about science, technology, and the impulses that push it.
Thank you, Usha. And I think just to build on that in terms of some of the other books that you have and also connected to what you were saying, something I've heard you say is, you respond to this quote about data being the new oil. And you say, do we want data to be the new oil? And this is where I think some of the mining, the exploitation comes in. I see Kate Crawford's book, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about that.
Actually, data as the new oil is not something that I just said. I think it's a lot of people said it, and I was quoting them as saying it, including our own industrialist, Mr. Mukesh Ambani, who had a very interesting take on it. He said data is the new oil, and Indians' data should not be all over the place. It should come back to Indians, or at least to Indian corporates. So there is a way in which we think about this. I also find that analogy is classic. It's very significant, because if you look at the last century, almost every, except for the First and Second World Wars, every other war, and there have been huge numbers of wars in the last century, they've all been around oil. So it's like a confession that they are making that when data is the new oil, the battles around the world, the wars that will be fought, will be in the context of data. And I think that we are seeing a bit of that when we see what's happening in Ukraine and the way technology is being used. We see it where Elon Musk says, my Starlink will only give it to certain people who I say it should go to. And one man, who among a few others has become suddenly rich by providing things free for us. And so hugely rich that they can now think in terms of establishing their domain in Mars and any other place that they are able to reach, tells us today who in any war will be entitled, who they will entitle people to get information, to be connected, and all the others will not be entitled to it. We also know that he went to Israel. He made statements in Israel about how, well, if Hamas came in and did the killing, then killers deserve to be killed. So there is a whole way of thinking that goes with it. There is a certain, I think sometimes euphemisms are a good idea. So there's a certain naivety to the way technology controllers seem to think. But there is another thing that also happens, which is that you have a lot of myth making. That is a necessary part of how technology is rolled out in our midst, especially as we see technologies having to become ubiquitous, as the whole universe has to adopt it. We find that there are mythologies that are created. One of those is that technology is environmentally sound, whereas what we've had so far has been very unsound. It's taken away our forests, now they are going to give us something that is sound. So again, in the words of Kate Crawford, who's written this book called Atlas of AI, she says there are 17 rare earth elements. Lanthanum, cerium, I'm never sure what, when you have a P at the beginning of a letter, I don't know if the P is supposed to be silent, so I'm just going to pronounce it, yeah? Praseodymium, neodymium, promethium, samarium, europium. Do you really want to continue with that? A number of them, it's like 4 lines of iums. They are processed and embedded in laptops and smartphones, making those devices smaller and lighter. The elements can be found in color displays, speakers, camera lenses, rechargeable batteries, hard drives, and many other components. They are key elements in communication systems, from fiber optic cables and signal amplification in mobile communication towers to satellites and GPS technology. But extracting these minerals from the ground often comes with local and geopolitical violence. Mining is and always has been a brutal undertaking. As Louis Mumford writes, mining was the key industry that furnished the sinews of war and increased the metallic contents of the original capital hoard, the war chest. On the other hand, it furthered the industrialization of arms and enriched the financier by both processes. To understand the business of AI, we must reckon with the war, famine, and death that mining brings with it. Yeah, so that kind of answers some of what you were saying.
Thanks, Usha. And I think, so we've got the environment, we've got the harmful effect on the environment. What about technology and interpersonal relations, right? We're told that technology is supposed to bring us closer. It's supposed to connect the world. It's supposed to free up time for us. I think I read somewhere that based on one of the authors you were telling me about, that John Maynard Keynes, famous economist from the early part of the 20th century, said that based on his estimation, the way technology was developing, he concluded that by the dawn of the 21st century, people would only be working 10 hours a week, if that, because technology would take care of so much and they wouldn't have to. But again, I see a couple of very interesting books which you talk about, Usha, that maybe challenge that notion of technology actually causing conflict and exacerbating conflict rather than resolving it. And I'm thinking of Blood in the Machine, the Luddites, again a phrase, a term that maybe some of your critics may apply to you. And I'm thinking, I see IBM and the Holocaust, which is a chilling account of, of course, one of the greatest tragedies of humankind, and but the role that technology plays there. So maybe if you could talk about that. You mentioned wars, you mentioned conflicts, you mentioned Musk, it's darling, but if you could just take it further based on these books.
You also started with connectedness and keeping us connected with people and things. I actually find that the stage we've reached now is it's really dystopic. I avoided using that word for the longest time because I said there's no such thing as dystopia. We've got to learn to deal with whatever the reality is as the reality and not consign it to being dystopic. But when I start reading about big tech and anybody who's able to do it, wanting to create other universes and other worlds into which you can put yourself, I was thinking, the difference between what Edward Snowden says, in his book, and then where he says the great thing about it when he started using the internet, when he would go on the net and he would connect with people, was that you could be anonymous, you could change your name every day, you could make as many mistakes as you wanted and then recover from the mistake, because it gave you the freedom to explore. Now today you find that has completely changed. We are so watched that you just breathe wrongly once and there'll be an insurance company waiting to see that if you're breathing right or not. So we're in a completely different place. But it's not just that. It is that we're saying, which is what the big tech people are saying. I mean, if you take Jeff Bezos or you take Elon Musk, they are saying that this world has become horrible. I mean, what is this? Pollution. We sit in Delhi, we know what pollution is. So we will, I think it's Bezos who says, we'll set up something in Mars and then you can, let the factories be here and we'll come here and take the product and go. It is not just colonization, it's not neo-colonialism. It is another way in which the dispensability of certain classes of human beings is being cast. So I just think that we can't think, the way to think about technology, I find, is not to ask the questions that we're being asked to ask. Ask our own questions. Learn to read the signs ourselves. I mean, we've been given minds, and we are, what this technology is doing is basically saying, why are you using your mind? Some while ago, I was in conversation with a philosopher who said that, throughout there's been a deliberate attempt. Science has at different points in time created conditions where we become more and more incapable. That's one of the ways in which science becomes, and technology becomes even more. So very broadly, I would say, I've been saying that science is about the production of knowledge and technology is about the tools that you create using it. And it is a way in which they're constantly telling us that you don't need to know. So he gave an example of the calculator and said once you get the calculator, you don't do the math in your head. You don't need to do it. So there is a way in which what you need and you don't need is given to you, and then you become that person. So there are skills you lose and you don't get any skills in return. You're handing it over to the machine. So what does that mean? What does that mean in human life? At that point, I just want to say, there's a report that came up 2 or 3 years ago on what is called human augmentation, a new paradigm. That's the report. And it's a report that's been adopted by the UK Department of Defence and by the German defence establishment. And it's about making soldiers, those who go to war, making them even better at their task than they are. So in doing that, they say that to do that, you need to know the person better. And they say that the human being needs to be augmented, and that can only be done by an interface with the machine. So it's not just that the worth of the human being is being rendered less and less. It is also that the existence of the human being outside of that interface with the machine is being seen as completely useless. And there's a lot of conversations that you hear in different places, and some of the writings also produce that, where they're saying, you have to adapt to this, otherwise who are you, why are you even relevant in this? So in this they say that to know the human being better, you need to know, to augment the human being, you need to know how they drink, how they hydrate themselves, how they sleep, how they eat, when they sleep, are they restless, do they walk? So the Internet of Things is already in our midst and we are not even noticing it. When I see people look very proudly at their watches and it's telling somebody somewhere all manner of things about you, my heart goes out to you. It's like, why? What's happened to our minds? Have we completely sent it to the pawn shop? What have we done? So that. Yeah.
So before I open it up for questions, Usha, where do we go from here? I've heard you say that people should throw away their mobile phones. I wonder if you stand by that. You've talked about how in law there is this concept of your home is your castle and that's where the power of the state stops. But you've gone on to say that your mobile phone has much more about you that is vulnerable than your home ever can. So what's the way forward? How do people here who are again going to be the engine of tech policy, tech developments in the next 2-3 decades, how do they take your lesson forward and implement change in a positive direction so that when we come back for the 20th celebration, you can say, yes, good job.
You're sounding like the Apple ad now. I'm not going down that route. I actually can't. I'm very bad at telling people what to do or not to do. I just think that for a lot of us at this stage, when we know so little, and even the tech providers and creators, they just know that they want control. It's an age of mass surveillance, it's an age of mass control, and whatever can be done to acquire that, they would like to have. That's it. I'm not even sure that the tech controllers or tech creators know exactly where we will be going. It's not like it's plotted. The plotting is only for more control, more profit, more redundancy of people. So there's a very clear social eugenics context in this. So that I think is pretty plain. But there's something you mentioned in the last question which I think I should really answer about being a Luddite. And yeah, of course I hear that all the time. And then I have also thought, what exactly does it mean when you say, who is this Ludd? But then I think I got caught up in other things. Also, I was a little lazy, so I didn't follow up on it. But there's one very kind soul has done that work for me. It's Brian Merchant, and it's a recent book called Blood in the Machine. And he too kept getting called. He was a tech reporter, and he too kept getting, you'll ask any questions about technology, they'll say, oh, you're a Luddite. He heard it so frequently, he decided he'll just go and find out who this Ludd is. And so he has so I'll just read out 2 little passages for you. See, the book that he's written, he goes back to the time in the late 1700s, actually early 1800s, 1811, 1812, that period, when a lot of interesting people were there. I mean, when you read this, you'll find, I'm not going to tell you, you should read some of them, and it's fascinating, that period. But he goes back to the period and he finds that this idea of Ludd exists from a time when power loom was trying to take over in the textile industry. And those who were, doing the weavers themselves were resisting this. They were resisting it partly because they were saying that what you are producing is not good stuff. What we produce is good. I'm sorry, but it's true with technology today too. They say, I'll give you an identity, and people are losing their identities in the process. The earlier system was certainly something you could negotiate and get back into, but this is completely leaving people out in the cold. So they were fighting that, and they were also fighting this, saying that, listen, when we do our weaving, when we are all communities of weavers, when we use the frame and we do our own weaving, we are all providing for ourselves. Now you have a few people who are bringing in the power loom and want to take over all the business. So we have to come and work in your looms as workers. You'll keep us when you want us, you'll throw us out when you don't want us, and many of us will have no jobs because it's going to produce at a much faster pace, even if it is, even if it's not as good, the material. And I think that's true in our industry, in our textile industry here too. So there were protests that happened, and many of them got together, and it's like a form of unionization. That's not what it was thought of as then. And they then, as collectives, started going into the factories of these, where there were these power looms, and all they destroyed were the power looms. They did not destroy the whole factory, they did not attack anybody. They went place after place, announced that they would be going there, and they would break the power looms, saying this is destroying our lives. So I'll just read out two brief passages for you. One is to tell you who Ludd was. At the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, before the dominance of the machines was certain, a legend grew about a young man who broke them. And then I'll skip a bit and then say, the spirit of the legend, its relatability, gave it advantage. Ludd likely never existed at all. But his avatar would become a mascot, an organizing tool, and a winking joke, a powerful 19th century meme. Like Robin Hood, Ned Ludd lent his name to a broader struggle that was very real, whether or not he was. Every good legend needs an origin story. To those being ground under the gears of the Industrial Revolution, Ludd, who perhaps never existed at all, would become a captain, a general, and even a king. So that's who I would be if I were a Luddite. Thank you very much. But I just want to tell you, what is the power that a state is willing to exert when it is on the side of those, who want to do what they want to do. So I'll just give you a little bit on that. So this is, because there are all these power looms being broken, there are many of those who are in those districts who own these power looms, other gentry who are very upset that that their power looms are being broken. They're not able to protect themselves. So they write letter after letter. So I'll just read out a little bit for you from here and what the state does. Letter after letter made it clear that the entrepreneurs, magistrates, and gentry were deeply rattled by this movement of machine breakers. So much so that the machine owners and their allies turned to the Home Office for armed backup, whether or not their cities had seen any Luddite disturbances. But what was Ryder, who was in charge at that time, supposed to do? Send dragoons to every nervous magistrate who wrote him a letter. He'd already dispatched a huge force to Nottingham, and just mark the succeeding words. Larger than the army currently fighting Napoleon in Spain, in fact. That's how the Luddites were treated, to the armed forces. How many troops did these people think he could spare? There was a war on, after all. Then, on February 14, 1812, Ryder stood to address the House of Lords and proposed a law that would make the consequences for destroying machines much more severe. In his speech, Ryder painted the Luddites as terrorists, calling them evil perpetrators of a system of riot that had existed for the last 3 months, a system bordering almost on insurrection. He did not mention that workers in Nottingham were desperate and impoverished, or that craftsmen had repeatedly petitioned the Crown and his administration for relief. Ryder said he wouldn't comment on the substance of the dispute. though he did speculate that the trouble was caused by unfortunate market fluctuations. In an effort to demonstrate the lengths of his office, office had already gone to stop the Luddites, Ryder explained that by last December, he had ordered 900 cavalry and 1,000 infantry to Nottingham. This, he said, was a larger force than had ever been found necessary in any period of our history to be employed in the quelling of any local disturbance. Yet it wasn't enough. After all, some manufacturers had raised their prices, while others gave up the machines altogether. The Luddites' messy rebellion was gaining ground. To break it required a firmer punishment. The laws calling for a decade and a half of exile for breaking machinery had proved completely insufficient, said Ryder. He now proposed that the offence should now be made capital. Luddites who destroyed manufacturers' frames, he said, should face the death penalty for breaking the machinery of automation. It's not new. The attack on people today has been there forever, and people have had to put up a battle because it destroys people's lives. That's the fact of it. And I think we are seeing that with this too. See, technology as a facilitator, technology as a tool, technology as a slave of the person and not the person as a slave of technology has a very different meaning. And there was a possibility, I believe, in the first decade of this century when it could have moved in that direction. But profit, the fact that, the 5 of the, top 10 companies, richest companies, and 5 of the top richest people turned out to be tech people, you can imagine the kind of ambition that gives them. And it's in that, it's in that process that the idea of surveillance, the idea of control, the idea of datafication of people so that you can produce AI. There is one little reference in one of the books where they say, IBM was doing facial recognition, and it was found that it wasn't working very well. There were errors that were creeping up, and IBM said, yeah, you're right. Actually, it is true that there are some errors, but there is a way to resolve this. If everybody gets onto the database all around the world, if everyone gets onto the database, then our failure rate will fall. So the idea that we have to become slaves of that technology, we become data for people who want to create this. It's what Mr. Nilekani said when he was talking about a trickle up, the trickle up effect, where he said, people in this country especially don't have wealth, but they have something that can create wealth, and that is their data. So these are ways of thinking, and I think that's which is why I say, if you ask me what is your advice on this, I have no advice. The only thing that I say is, we need to do our own thinking, we need to learn to read what's being said, we need to learn what is not being said. Reading silences is as important, and whenever there is a diversion, it's important not to get diverted. I know that's advice, but that's not really, that's only telling you what I try and do.
Well, thank you so much for that, Usha. And we move to questions. I'll maybe start with a question from the audience that has come online, which is, do you think we need more interdisciplinary research and advocacy collaborations with computer scientists and tech developers? And will that help create better regulatory structures to rein in the dystopian tech-led future?
So in any field, any subject that you take, at least what I broadly see is that it is only when a person feels either equally threatened by what's happening or at least understands threats and is willing to see it, only then will conversations begin. When somebody is powerful at a point in time and somebody else does not have that power, when the person without that power approaches the powerful to say, let's talk about this, let me tell you what is happening with this, we've tried that for the past 13 years. And it won't work because tech is powerful today. It's when they come crashing that they will need our help, and I think many of us have shoulders that will lend to them. One other thing on interdisciplinarity.
Yes.
I think disciplines are constructs. We don't need to think within disciplines. We just need to think.
Lovely. We can open it up to audience questions. Maybe if we can start with someone from the back, if there's someone who would like to came to the front. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. Everyone can hear me. Okay. Thank you so much for this talk. It's been really fascinating. I wanted to ask, and you gave several examples that with the existence of new technology, it has disrupted society in a certain way, and that's always been the case. So my question is, with the mobile phone, internet, AI, this current age that we're in, what makes it different? Is it you know the last point that you were saying that previously technology was a tool and in this case technology isn't a tool, and if so, what is it then? How do we view technology? So yeah.
You know, there is, when we think of climate change, we tend to think of carbon credits, carbon sequestration, forests, trees. But I don't think we spend enough time thinking about how we got to this point. We started about 300 years ago, 250 years ago, and we reached this point now where we are talking about possible human extinction in whatever, except those who manage to get into, purified air-held bunkers. It's not even like just vague talk. It is, a serious problem. On technology, we find that these terms again coming into use. We've heard the term human extinction again. I mean, Stephen Hawking, who I find really interesting, sometimes I don't understand what he says, but I keep trying to read him and to understand more. But there are very many times when he can be, very clearly understood. One of the things he said was, and he was a man who depended on the machine, he depended on artificial intelligence, he depended on speech, and recognition and neural technologies for being able to communicate the richness of the life that he may not have had without that technology. He warned that don't let the machine, don't let artificial intelligence take over from the human. When the machine takes over from the human, and now I'm paraphrasing everything, basically saying that when the machine takes over, then the human being is you're vulnerable, you're insecure, you're irrelevant. So don't let that happen. So I find it very interesting that the human being is being trained to give up being human. It's the extent to which we have a deficit of love for ourselves is incredible. Of course, technology controllers and technology creators who sit in a rarefied space see the rest of humanity differently from themselves. That is pretty plain. So it's about what they want to do with the others. And that's what's producing, if I'm not answering your question, forgive me, but I usually end up doing that. I mean, I say the things I want to say when something in your question triggered off something. So there is a way in which, therefore, we are being taught to think. One of the ways of thinking about this is that, which is why I've started this, that this is a field without a philosophy. So too was economics for the longest time. It was a pragmatic kind of statement of how you think the world should be. It's the way the Industrial Revolution was brought in. Something was possible for them to do, and therefore they did it, not because something would be good. In this age, I find that this is what we followed. Why it couldn't have happened before is because it had to happen with computerization, it had to happen with digitization, and then it also had to happen at a time, and I think as a historical point in time, it's very important. It's happening at a time when authoritarian governments are in many parts of the world. And this kind of imposition of various systems on people can only happen when across the world you have either authoritarian governments or governments that give a lot of space for industry, for corporate business interests to do what it wants. And that, I think, is a significant factor to what's happening now. In the 90s, in the field of business and human rights, there was an attempt to, there was an attempt, and I think a pretty decent attempt, it did arrive somewhere, where they were saying that, when land would be taken away for projects, the companies would say, I didn't take the land. I didn't even go there to collect the land. The government gave it to me, I only put the project up. And in business and human rights, there was a concept that was introduced called complicity. If you are complicitous with the state, and then you're making profits on it, you're setting your machinery and equipment on it, so the idea of complicity was brought in. Now we find that it's gone beyond complicity, it's gone into partnerships. And there is a book by Heather Brooks where she gives you just a paragraph where she tells you that after the dot-com bust, after whatever money could be made off the turn of the century, the millennium, crisis, after all that was over, the tech industry needed to find its relevance. So there was a meeting of the EU in Lisbon, and she talks about how the tech companies went to the governments there and said, listen, you've got to do something to help us survive. And you find from that point on, everybody is doing, what's it called? E-governance. So suddenly it becomes e-governance. And the very interesting thing is that one of the things that e-governance does is it disintermediates, which means that people who are making decisions for other people don't need to know people as people. They just need to know people as data. So these are all processes. And the other thing to remember is Bill Gates, for instance, has been very anxious. I mean, in one of the videos, he's talking about how he was, at one time when he was taking vaccine to Africa, he says, Melinda and I thought about whether we were doing a good thing by taking vaccine to Africa, because then there's so much population there already and there will be more people then there. And then he says, no, but then we realized that it's a good thing to take the vaccines, because then parents will have less incentive to have more children. So there are all manner of decisions and all manner of thinking about us which is happening among people who honestly don't know us at all. And there's a recent book on the problem that is Bill Gates or something, which has recently come by Tim Schwab. So there is a lot of literature that's coming out. Many of the questions we are asking ourselves, there are answers embedded in many of these places. We just need to look for them.
More questions? I think there's someone at the back maybe? Or
so my question is about how you can argue against convenience. So whether it was the convenience. So whether it was the example that you gave of the original Luddites, or if we're looking at systems of surveillance, monitoring or data collection like Aadhaar or DigiYatra, there have been systems that have been implemented by economic interests and political and national security interests over decades, which make it convenient just like coincidentally for only one path to work, and any opposition against it cannot stand. So how do you either argue against it by saying that we can't have this sort of a policy or this is where we draw the line, or how do you recontextualize it when when newer policies are made on those same lines? So we can't obviously go back to a time without Aadhaar or DigiYatra or without these mass manufactured textiles. So like how do we stop or recontextualize this so that we stop any other arguments made for convenience?
I totally endorse this, that we can't go back anywhere. But I don't know that we can't do away with things that are there now as we go forward. So there are many things, for instance, we have whole policies now on handloom and the textile sector coming up in a different way. But actually what I want to say is not quite on that. What I do want to say is that there is when we state the question like this, then what we are not acknowledging is the number of people who are being rendered redundant. So there is a website called Speculative Capital. And if you go on to that, you have a person who's been questioning or constantly giving information, data to tech and saying, why are we all acting as free workers for these tech companies? And he raises questions about it. But he's also been trying to do the practical thing and to say, okay, if workers are not going to have work, they're going to be laid off because of this, because of the kind of technologies that are coming in and the kind of automation, the kind of machines that will come in, then workers have to find some other relevance for themselves. So he's experimented with this where he says, okay, he's got workers lying flat on, on some kind of a bed, clothed in leather, clothed in material that will help generate heat. And he says the next round may just be, and he's actually got, the last I saw, he had 38 people who he was getting employed like this. That they will lie there and their job will be to generate heat. Because this is the other thing, among the myths that is said, that's not spoken about at all, is the amount of energy that is needed for this kind of technology to, continue happening. So that is what we are reducing people to. So it's not only inequality, it's also about various forms of redundancy that we are bringing to large masses of human beings. So it's a question of what it's what question you ask. If we were to say that this is convenient, how do you challenge convenience? Actually, it's not convenient for a lot of people. It's not true at all that it's convenient for large numbers of people.